Okay, today we are going to talk about the Durston X-Mid Pro 2. This is a Dyneema Composite Fabrics tent. It is pitched with 2 trekking poles and it has 2 doors, 2 vestibules, and it's a side entry tent. This video is separated into 3 sections. We're going to talk about setup, livability, and then a Q&A that addresses a variety of different topics, including the storm performance of this tent. The Durston X-Mid Pro has 2 unique features. The first is the interior space or volume for its weight. This is a 20 ounce, 21 ounce, 2-person tent with an enormous interior volume to it. The second unique feature, and it is unique among most trekking pole supported tents out there, are its ease of setup. Unlike most trekking pole tents, the Durston X-Mid Pro 2 has a rectangular footprint. So like a pyramid, it's very easy to pitch, doesn't require micro adjustments of trekking poles and things like that in order to get a precision pitch out of it. So with that, let's go ahead and get started and we'll take a look at setup. Okay, to show you what we're working with here, I've set the tent on the ground upside down. So what you're actually looking at is the floor of the tent, and you can see that this floor is oriented on a diagonal relative to the rectangular footprint of the tent. So keep that in mind when you're pitching the tent, and you'll want to orient that floor over the flattest area of your tent site because that's where the sleeping bags are going to go. So it's a little bit non-intuitive with most rectangular tents. You're just going to orient the long side of the rectangle relative to the flattest part of your site. With the Durston X-Mid, you've got this diagonally oriented floor to deal with. Okay, in preparation for pitching the X-Mid Pro, you're going to take each of the 4 corner guy lines and you're going to pull this tag in through the line lock just a little bit. If you don't do that and you pitch the tent tight with the line fully extended, it's going to be really hard to disengage the knot from the line lock and tighten the shelter. So just make sure you have a tag end ready to work with before you start pitching the tent. The Durston X-Mid Pro pitches with a minimum of 4 stakes, and we're going to talk about that because that's one of its selling features, is the minimal amount of stakes you need to get a stable pitch. We are going to pitch one end first and then the other, and I'll show you kind of the order in which we tighten things up in order to get that perfect rectangle. And then we're going to put the 2 poles up, and in theory that should be enough to get a stable pitch out of it. Now once the 2 stakes on one of the ends is pitched, you'll bring out this 3rd corner and try to make sure there's a perfect 90-degree angle from the end wall to the side wall right here. And then you'll position your stake at a 45-degree angle out from that corner. And then you'll do the final stake corner again, just making sure that there's a 45-degree angle between the end wall and the far side wall here, and again between the far end wall and the side wall here. Now it's perfectly normal not to get it perfect the first time, so you can see that I've got a pretty straight side wall, nice taut end wall, but this end wall is a little bit sagging, so we're going to reposition that corner stake, and that should get us a perfect rectangle. You have some pitching options with the X-Mid. It has some flexible geometry to it. So first, we're going to pitch it with the side walls and end walls down to the ground as low as possible. And this gives the tent the best storm worthiness, but at the expense of headroom and ventilation. But in order to get it pitched for storm worthiness, we're going to pitch it down to the ground. So we're going to adjust the guy lines so they are as short as possible through the line locks, and then we may have to reposition the stakes accordingly. So let's do that. Now the X-Mid pitches at a height of around 46 inches. That doesn't mean you have to have your trekking poles precisely measured to 46 inches. In fact, you can put the trekking pole in and raise it until the tent is taut, and then you don't have to worry about it. And it really doesn't matter if the tent is pitched lower by a few centimeters or higher by a few centimeters. The geometry will accommodate the pole length that you set to it. So the real goal here is just to put the trekking poles in and extend them to the point where the tent is then tensioned. So I'll go ahead and extend the bottom section, and then we'll make our adjustments with the top section here. Okay, so we're going to open the zipper door and insert the pole through the zipper. And the reason I prefer that over inserting it through the vent is that you can see what you're doing and there's less likely you're going to do any damage to the tent. So the X-Mid pitches with the pole tip down into the ground and the grip being inserted into a pole cap that sits at the apex of the tent here. So putting the pole in and then just lifting it up until the tent is taut. And we'll do the same thing on this side. And if you come in and look at the inner tent, there's an elastic loop here, and that slips right around the pole tip, and that allows the inner tent to be tightened against the pole. So we're going to raise our pole until the tent ridgeline is tight. Zip the door closed. And now you have the basic pitch of the X-Mid with 4 stakes, and it's in a storm pitch so that the sidewalls are all the way down to the ground. Now, unless you're expecting very heavy rain, I would not pitch the tent down to the ground like this. Giving a little bit of extra room under the sidewalls provides more ventilation, which will reduce condensation inside the tent, and it will make the interior floor a little bit more tight, which is nice for gear organization and aesthetics. Now, intuitively, if you think you want to have more ventilation and less storm protection, you might think that loosening the guylines, raising the poles, and retightening the guylines is going to do it. So that's what we've done now. But as you can see, when I retighten the guylines, the geometry doesn't quite accommodate that. So these edges are going to be loose since you've retightened these poles. So that means what you need to do is extend the guylines, drop the poles, reset the stakes, and then reinsert the poles. So the geometry is flexible if the stakes are movable, but the geometry is not flexible for lowering and raising the tent if the stakes stay in the same spot. So we'll go ahead and repitch it now into a pitch that allows for more ventilation underneath the sidewalls. Once you have the stakes repositioned, hold off on tightening the guylines too much. You want it to be taut, but we're going to crank down on the guylines only after we set the poles. So let's do that now. Okay, now that we have our poles up, you can see that along the, excuse me, come here, over here, get back. Okay, so now that we have our poles up, you can see that we have one sidewall here that's a little bit loose. And that's because there was a rock over in that corner and I could not take that stake out at a perfect 45-degree angle. So all we're going to do is move this stake a little bit so that it can retension that end wall while maintaining the tension along this sidewall. Okay, so now with this 4-stake pitch, 2 poles, everything's tightened, we have a shelter that can withstand rain and light breezes just fine. So it's very simple to achieve this pitch quite quickly. Now, if you look at the stability of the pole apex points, you can see there's a lot of movement here. So if you're expecting high winds, we want to minimize that movement in these apex points. Because what's going to happen is a wind is going to come against these large fabric panels, and if these apex points are movable, then that's going to cause a loss of tension elsewhere in the tent, and that's where you start getting some extreme buffeting. So this isn't a storm pitch. This is a utilitarian functional pitch for mild weather. Now, the only way to address this lack of tension as the tent stands pitched right now is by tightening the guy lines. The problem with this is that there's a limit to how much these guy lines can be tightened. The tent ships with these very light aluminum V-channel stakes, and they don't have a lot of holding power, especially in loose forest soil or sandy soils like what we're in today. So there's going to be a limit to how much tension you can exert on these stakes. But before you continue the rest of the pitch, I encourage you to tighten the 4 stakes down as much as feasible. And if you're going to be in loamy or sandy soils, consider replacing the stock tent stakes with something a little bit longer and a little bit more surface area and holding power. Okay, we have tightened these stakes down. It has improved the tension and stability of the tent a bit, but if you come down here and take a look at the stakes, there's enough tension being pulled on them that these stakes are starting to rip out of this sandy soil. So the only way to combat that in soils like this are to place big rocks on these corner stakes. They're going to take the brunt of the load, and that's really the only way you can keep these stakes in place if you don't have a larger stake to replace them with. Okay, so this is one of my favorite features of the X-Mid design. With 4 stakes properly set so that the stakes are either big and strong enough to have a lot of holding power so you can crank down a lot of tension, or you've got some very heavy rocks on them, you can get a surprisingly stable, weather-worthy pitch with this tent. If you compare it to something like the Gossamer Gear DCF the 2 or the Z-Pax Duplex, both of these tents absolutely require 6 stakes minimum, and you're probably not going to get this much stability out of those shelters even with 6 stakes. Now with the Tarptent Dipole, which is also pitched with a minimum of 4 stakes, you get a nice structurally stable shelter. But if you're going to have any kind of wind, what's going to happen with the dipole is, because there's not a lot of tension on the ridgeline pulling the apex poles out, what happens is as wind buffets the end of the dipole, those apex points move inward along a very loose ridgeline, and you don't quite have that with the X-Mid. The poles do move. They are moving in a little bit different direction though. They're pretty stable along the ridgeline. I would argue that with 4 stakes, the Durston X-Mid Pro 2 is a more stable shelter than the Tarptent Dipole 2. But that begs the question, what about for storm conditions where I need to stabilize as much as possible? Which tent of all of these tents is the most stable shelter? We're going to answer that question now. So if you expect to take the X-Mid Pro into stormy conditions, there are 8 additional stakeout points on the shelter. You have 1 on each sidewall at the base of the zipper. You have a guyline attachment point at the midpoint seam on each sidewall. We've got 1 at the end of each end wall. And finally, there are apex guyline attachment points at each pole apex. Now the tent only ships with 2 additional stakes for a total of 6. Most people are going to use those stakes at the base of the vestibule door where the zipper is, and I'll show you why. When you open the zipper door, you can roll the door back and secure it with a magnetic strap there. But a similar way to secure the small part of the door does not exist. There's no retainer cord or strap on this side. So your options are to leave it open and let it flap, or to stake it out to the ground right here, which is what you'll find in most of the photos you see online for X-Mid Pro pitches. So let's go ahead and stake that out and see what it does to the overall tension of the tent. And we'll do the other side too. Okay, so now what you've effectively done is pulled a line of tension from the apex down to the ground along the zipper. And in theory, that should help stabilize this pull apex. So let's close the other zipper door and see if that actually pans out in practice. So you can see that with the sidewalls staked out, it doesn't do much. Okay, so this isn't going to be an important storm stakeout point for stabilizing the apex pulls on the shelter. Now, if you bring extra stakes, you're going to get the most bang for your buck by attaching guy lines to the apex guy line tie-out points. So that's what we've done. The tent ships with about 30 to 35 feet of guy line cordage. You'll need about 8 feet or so for each of the apex guy lines. The apex guiline should be oriented parallel to the ridge line because that is ultimately what you're trying to stabilize. So now with those apex guylines in place, we've reduced the ability of the apex to move in the direction parallel to the guyline, which improves the stability of the loading across that guyline quite a bit. If you get a broadside load, you can still see that we've got some sagging in the ridgeline. And that's because these panels are so big and so hard to stabilize that it's going to be difficult to keep everything from moving around in a big wind. So now when you add tension to the apex guylines, you're going to disrupt the forces at the apexes quite a bit. So you can see this by noting that I've got some play here. Because I have tightened this guy line, I've got more play now in this ridgeline seam that goes from the apex down to the corner of the tent. So we can play around with this and iteratively tighten the guy lines on the perimeter of the tent. So we'll start with this one here, which is the one that became the loosest. And we'll do the same with this back one. Okay, so we've used 4 of the remaining 8 guyline tie-out points. We have these mid-panel guyline tie-outs over here on the side panels. And really these only serve one function, and that is to prevent massive deflection of this large sidewall in a broadside wind. So these I would consider last. I would say these are the least important for helping the tent maintain its structure. You're not going to be able to pull a line of tension off this side guy line from the apex point down to the ground. So it is only preventing that side panel from deflecting. So we're going to skip that one for now. The other ones on the side panels are these midpoint ones along the edges. Again, you're not going to do much to stabilize the pull apexes by using these. The purpose of these is to prevent this edge from flapping around and to increase tension in the overall side panel. So again, these aren't going to provide a lot of structure. They're just going to prevent deformation of the side panel. Now it's a little different story with the end panel edge tie-outs right here. These have a seam going directly up to the pole apex, and so now we're actually able to create some tension between the ground, which is immovable, and that pole apex, which we want to be immovable. So we're going to go ahead and stake these out. You can add a stake directly, but since we have our tent pitched a few centimeters off the ground, it's going to be difficult to hold that in. So the way around it is you pull the shock cord tight so that it elongates the attachment point, or you add an accessory piece of short guy line here. But we're going to go ahead and pull it tight. And see if that stake can get into the soil there. And now we've created a line of tension from the stake out point all the way up to the pole apex here, and that has actually done a lot to stabilize that pole apex. So we'll go ahead and do the other side as well. So what we've done by setting this stakeout point and the stakeout point at the base of the zipper is created a second and third line of tension in addition to the corner that is stabilizing that pole apex in the direction parallel to the ridge line. So now we've done this on each side, and we can see that if I try to move that pole parallel to the ridge line, it does not move. It's very, very stable. So ultimately what that's going to do is make the tent very aerodynamic and wind stable for gusts parallel to the ridge line. So when you're pitching the X-Mid, make sure you are pitching it so that the ridge line is parallel to the direction of the wind. The problem occurs when wind starts buffeting the broadside of the tent, because if you watch the palm of my hand here, the pole apex is not stable in the direction perpendicular to the tent. This is the biggest difference between the X-Mid Pro and the Tarptent Dipole. Because the Tarptent Dipole has symmetrically opposite forces that are stabilizing both the end struts and the apex poles, it is stable in all directions. You don't get that with the X-Mid. You only get maximum stability in the X-Mid along the direction of the ridge line. So again, I just want to emphasize, pitch the tent so that the ridge line is in the direction of the wind. Okay, so we highlighted what I think is one of the main features of the X-Mid, and that is its ease of setup and its stability in mild conditions using only 4 tent stakes. The other issue that really sets the X-Mid Pro apart from other tents is what I'm going to call the livability to weight ratio. This is a 20 to 21 ounce tent. By the time you add tent stakes and guylines, you might kit out at about 24 or 25 ounces. But if you look at the interior dimensions of this tent, it's 48 inches wide. It's effectively about 90 inches long, so it can accommodate tall users, and it's 46 inches tall. So even if you're using an inflatable pad that's 3 inches thick and you're sitting up and you're 6'3", 6'4", your head is not going to brush the interior wall of the tent. Now, it depends on where you're sitting. Now, this is an asymmetrical design, which means headroom is different between the head end and the foot end, and it's different on both sides. So the ideal sleeping configuration for 2 people is going to be head to toe. So one person's head being at one end of the tent and the other person's head being at the other end of the tent. Now, if you're on the shorter, smaller side, 2 people can easily sleep head to head, or you can put a double or a couple's quilt or sleeping bag in here and sleep as a couple just fine. Just keep in mind that one of the 2 is going to have less headroom than the other. For most people, in most conditions, this isn't going to make a difference, but if you're in very cold, condensation-prone conditions and you have the flexibility to do so, you may consider sleeping head to toe. The other feature I want to highlight, which I think is really cool, is when this side vestibule door is staked out, it creates a really large vestibule. So even when the tent door is open, you have a ton of gear storage room back here. And the reason is because this vestibule is so deep. I can effectively put a small backpack lengthwise in the width of the vestibule. So it's an enormous amount of gear storage while still allowing the door to remain open. Even for tall users using long pads, there's enough storage at either the head or foot end of your sleeping pad to store gear inside the tent. The only caveat is there's no interior storage pockets for organizing small bits of gear in the X-Mid Pro. We've already talked about wind resistance of the tent in the setup portion of the video. Let's talk a little bit about rain resistance. So the canopy is 0.55 ounce per square yard Dyneema Composite Fabrics. It's CT1E.08 is the model. It's a very common fabric used on tents in a number of ultralight designs. The X-Mid Pro is a hybrid between a single wall and a double wall tent. Inside the interior of the tent, it's effectively single wall. There's no mesh and then outer layer. It is just the outer layer. And then you have these mesh interior sidewalls that are your interior doors of the tent. And then beyond that, there's the Dyneema Composite Fabrics vestibule doors or sidewalls. And that's what makes the sides of the tent effectively double wall, while the interior of the tent, the actual living space, is single wall. So the tent is going to be prone to some condensation, like any of these designs, in cold and humid and or wet rainy conditions. The way to mitigate that is to raise the tent floor up a little bit during your pitching. So that's what we've done here, so that the sidewalls have a few inches to draw in cool, dry air. And then if it's raining really hard, you can close the doors, open the vents. There are 2 peak vents at both apex points, and they can be propped open with small struts. Condensation will drip down the sidewalls of the tent. There are condensation drains made of no-see-um mesh at each end of the tent, and that prevents the condensation from falling down onto the tent floor. In a driving heavy rain, I have experienced, when the tent has been pitched a couple inches off the ground, I have experienced the driving rain coming in, bouncing off the ground and up into those condensation drains. For the most part, it does not reach the interior of the tent. Those drains effectively block any moisture from coming in. The bathtub floor on the X-Mid Pro is one of the best I've ever used. Each corner of the floor is tensioned in height with a small carbon fiber strut, and then there's some shock cord and guyline cord that goes out to each corner stake. The floor is very stable, taut, and maintains a bathtub structure regardless of how the tent is pitched. So if you're using 2 wide pads like the Nemo Tensor, wide regular, wide long pads, they're a little bit too wide for a tent like this. And so what you'll end up doing is reducing some tension on the floor to allow it to expand to accommodate those pads, and then you lose some of the floor structure. Now, because this is a single wall tent that's really intended for 2 and 3 season use, it's not really intended for winter use, so don't expect too much out of snow loading. I did use a pre-production model earlier this spring in the snow in Colorado. It does have the ability to shed snow well because, one, it's Dyneema Composite Fabrics, which remains structurally quite stiff in the presence of cold and snowy conditions, and the snow slides off it fairly well. But these are still very large panels, and if the snow is wet and sticky, this tent is going to sag inward, and you're going to have to bang the snow off the shelter. This is not a winter tent. All right, let's talk a little bit about hail. There's been a lot of talk lately about hail and Dyneema Composite Fabrics, and whether or not Dyneema Composite Fabrics is an appropriate fabric for large hail. Fortunately, large hail is rare. However, I have experienced damage from hail on Dyneema Composite Fabrics tents. I have not experienced holes in the tent from large hail, but I have some tips for managing hail in a DCF tent. Now, you've got to be realistic about what your tent can do. DCF, its weakness and its Achilles heel is its puncture resistance. So if you are expecting to take a tent like this above tree line in a climate that has a high probability for large hail, I would rethink that. You might consider instead taking something like a sil nylon tent, where the fabric has more elasticity and is more likely to resist puncturing from hail. So that effectively makes DCF tents at this fabric weight, 0.55 ounces per square yard, usable below or at the tree line in climates where you expect to have large hail. And by large hail, I mean dime size hail or larger. Most Dyneema Composite Fabrics tents at this fabric weight can handle smaller hail just fine. It's not going to damage the tent. But by the time you get to the size of a dime or a marble, you are looking at a level of force that can easily put holes in a DCF tent. So keep that in mind. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and run through some questions. These are questions that came in on social media, into my email inbox, and on the forums at backpackinglight.com. Question 1 is, does rain enter the tent when the doors are open? The interior doors are vertical and protected by the canopy. So in a light overhead rain, rain is not going to enter the tent. As rain gets heavier, it's going to splash and bounce into the tent from the vestibule if you leave the vestibule doors open. Plus, if there's even the slightest bit of breeze one way or the other into the doors of the tent, rain's going to make its way in there. So this feature really has the benefit during getting in and out of the tent. You can enter and exit the tent with the doors open without letting a ton of rain inside the tent. You're always going to get a little bit of moisture, so make sure your expectations are aligned with how this works in reality. But it does allow you to enter and exit the tent without getting a lot of water in the tent. But if it's raining heavily, you're gonna want those vestibule doors closed. Second question, I've addressed this a little bit already, but I'll expand on it. Can heavy rain splash or splatter enter the tent via the condensation vents on the end? The answer is yes, but it takes a pretty heavy rain. So when I experienced this, rain drove into the end of the tent, bounced off the ground and up into the condensation drain, the mesh condensation drain. And the result was a very muddy, wet condensation drain, but not a lot of water actually entered the tent. Next question is, can two wide rectangular pads like the Nemo tensor fit? No, the floor is 48 inches wide. Each of those pads is 25 inches wide. It's a little bit less than that when they're fully inflated, but for the most part, these pads push the sidewalls out. Is it usable? Absolutely. I don't see any issues with it at all beyond just aesthetic issues and the fact that you're going to be very cozy with your tent partner because there's not a lot of room here. The Tarptent Dipole 2 easily fits two wide pads and provides some extra space so that if you're moving around on one pad, your tent partner is not going to feel it. Next question is, do trekking poles impede entry and exit? No, they are entirely out of the way of the door zippers. This is one advantage I see over the Tarptent Dipole 2, but it's a minor advantage. Now, if you're not using trekking poles and you're using fixed poles, and you want the maximum amount of flexibility to pitch the tent either a little bit higher for ventilation or a little bit lower for storm resistance, you're going to want those fixed poles to be a little bit longer than the 46-inch height of the tent. So that means you'll have to angle the poles a little bit if you want the tent pitched lower, and then they're going to come a little bit into the doorway of the tent, but it's not going to be enough to have a meaningful inconvenience. Next question is, what are your thoughts on the 15D silpoly floor? Durston opted to go with a silpoly floor versus a DCF floor because silpoly is more puncture resistant, it's more durable. The thing I like about silpoly, because I don't really care about floor durability just because DCF is so easy to repair, but the thing I like about silpoly is that it makes it a very compact tent. You don't have 1 ounce DCF to deal with, which is a very bulky fabric, and so the tent actually packs into a much smaller package than something like a Tarptent Dipole 2. The thing I don't like about the silpoly floor is that when you're using the new generation of inflatable pads like the Nemo tensor, these pads are noisy on this floor, and so it squeaks a lot. So this may be an issue if you're in a group camp and every time you flip over and change positions while sleeping, it's going to squeak and wake your neighbors or your tent partner. Okay, that's about it for this review. I hope it provided some value to you. So my two takeaways are that, one, the 4-stake pitch is easy and fast and allows you to get out of bad weather quickly. On the flip side of that, it's not quite as storm-worthy in terms of wind resistance as something like the Tarptent Dipole 2, which is a symmetrically tensioned tent that is quite a bit more stable than the X-Mid Pro. But with that said, is the X-Mid Pro still viable for stormy, windy conditions? The answer is absolutely yes. I've weathered gusts up to 45 to 50 miles an hour in the X-Mid, and it's no problem. It buffets around a lot, but to think that it's going to be a weak tent under these conditions, that's not going to happen. And so really your limitation is going to be the quality of the tent stakes and the quality of your pitch. The other thing that strikes me is the interior volume of the tent. So to have a tent that is this livable for 21 ounces is pretty nice, especially if you are a solo hiker and want some room to spread out, or if you're someone who wants one tent that can accommodate a hiking partner or a couple here and there, or a big dog like this. Her and I can sleep in the tent, and both of us have plenty of room not to get into each other's space. Okay, that's it. I hope you found the review valuable. I will put a link to our written review in the description of the video. That review is being constantly updated, and we'll have a full performance review up there later this year. I will also put links to our video review of the Tarptent Dipole and the written review of the Tarptent Dipole, and that will provide additional context into how the dipole compares in performance to the X-Mid Pro 2. And then finally, we'll put some resources in the description about Dyneema Composite Fabrics, including links to some member Q&As and some podcasts where we really dive into the engineering and design of tents using DCF and other materials. And I think if you are serious about getting a DCF tent, you need to be aware of some of its limitations as well as some of its strengths.